So we'll add another perturbation to the experiment of self-governance in the lab, common pool resource situation for action. And of course there are multiple players, there are rules to be followed, and we looked at how communication helps in this situation, or how it affects the outcome of the common pool resource experiment. Now we'll add costly sanctioning. What is costly sanctioning? As we said before, and we'll say again, it is basically where you are penalizing someone in the group for not following the rules or doing something that is not supposed to be done, of course. But penalizing them means you have to pay a fee, or it'll cost you. Rationalist choice, rational egoist theory would say that you would not want to pay a fee to penalize others. You will just focus on your own self-interest and maximizing it, so you will not lose anything by paying a fee. Whereas in reality it shows here that people are happy to pay a fee, but it depends on a couple of things. So participants in field settings are frequently able to communicate with one another on a face-to-face basis, at least from time to time, either in formally constituted meetings or at social gatherings. In many field settings where the resource has been sustained over a long time, participants have also devised a variety of formal or informal ways of monitoring and sanctioning one another if rules are broken. So any situation where a common pool resource has been sustained and there has been a triumph of the commons, that means they have devised a mechanism where self-governance has been made possible by using costly penalties as one of the tools. Okay. Engaging in costly monitoring and sanctioning behavior is, however, not consistent with the theory of a norm-free perfect rationality. Costly sanctioning means that individuals have the opportunity to pay to reduce earnings of another participant in the experiment. Thus, new experiments were held to test whether participants would actually pay from their own earnings in order to sanction the less cooperative behavior of the other participants. The idea is that you pay a little, penalize the other person to make them toe the line, then your earning will go back up and more than compensate for your loss in fees, right? Or you just sustain the resource for much longer. As in the communication experiment, participants first participated in 10 rounds of the baseline game where communication and penalties were not allowed. Participants were then told that in the subsequent rounds they would have an opportunity to pay a fee in order to impose a fine on the payoffs received by another player. The fees ranged across many different experiments from 5 cents to 20 cents, and the fines ranged from 10 cents to 80 cents. So obviously the fines have to be much higher than the fee you pay, so that the message is clearly sent to the violators. In brief, the finding from this series of experiments was that much more voluntary costly sanctioning occurred than the zero level predicted by the rational egoist model. Remember, we said that economists didn't believe in Eleanor Ostrom's story about Nepalese farmers fixing a mud canal to prevent theft. They said educated people will not spend resources on sorry about that. Expensive monitoring. I have some nasty allergy thanks to the pollution. Okay, so this is not what economists would expect, but that's what happened in the real world, at least in the experimental setup. Participants react both to the initial cost of sanctioning and to the fee to fine ratio. If you say you have to pay a very high fee to punish somebody, they may back off. But if they see that the fee to fine ratio is reasonable, sorry about that, then they will go for it. Sanctioning is primarily directed at those who invested more in the common pool resource. A few Okay, I skipped that next sentence. Should I read it? Let me make sure that I didn't omit something critical. A few sanctions, however, appear to be a form of blind revenge. These were fines made by participants who had themselves been fined by unknown others for their high levels of investment. In these few cases, the sanctioners picked on those whose investments were lower than others and thus were suspected of being the ones who had previously sanctioned them. So you have information about others and their investment in the common pool resource, and you did something that got you fined. Then next time you go after those who invested less, assuming that they must have punished you in the previous cycle, so you take a blind revenge without knowing necessarily that those are the people who punished you. It's possible that there are many who are over harvesting or investing too much in CPR and punishing the others who invest too much to make sure that others don't do what they are doing. So it's a complicated game. In this set of experiments, participants were able to increase their returns since participants reduced their investments, although they did not reach the maximum earnings. So when you're in a group setting and there is a common pool resource and a separate income stream from wages, how do you maximize the group earnings versus your own earnings? We already said it's not a rational egoist model, so people are not maximizing their self-interest, but they are still doing things that seem like they are making choices to somehow maximize earnings. However, if we look at the net earnings after subtracting the costs of the sanctioning system, we don't see any benefit from sanctioning. On the other hand, the performance was greatly increased if participants had the opportunity to communicate for just one round. Communications worked better in increasing the outcome or payoffs than sanctioning. Very critical learning lesson, right? Lesson learned. Outside of the lab, participants rarely impose sanctions on one another that have been devised by external entity, as in the experiments above. So here we are experimenters are offering a opportunity to do the penalizing. In the field, sanctions are much more likely to emerge from the endogenous process of communities crafting their own rules along with the punishments that should be imposed if the rules are broken. Spending time and effort in a linked collective choice situation designing rules creates a public good for all those involved. Crafting rules for an operational situation is thus a second level social dilemma. It's not the primary concern. You don't go in and thinking, let's make rules and punish those who don't follow the rules. This traditional theory of rational egoists predicts that people will not invest time and effort to create rules. That is the reason why many people argue that rules must be designed and imposed by external authorities who then assume official responsibility for monitoring and enforcing these rules and are paid a salary for their work. Since self-organized rules are found in many local common pool resource situations, it appears that participants frequently do design their own rules contrary to the theoretical prediction. But these processes are difficult to witness in the field. So this is where the tricky part comes. We are doing baseline experiments in the lab and even in the field, but they are experiments and they are baselines. What actually happens in the real situation is not that simple, so you have to understand the additional factors that come in on the human behavior in the self-governance situations in terms of choosing the investment in common pool resources and worrying about what others are doing who are in the same action situation. So this is the photo from Juan Camilo Cardenas explaining an experiment in the field in Colombia. So we will just look at that in a minute, but since the experiments were done in the university setting with students, would the findings from experiments with the villagers in rural Colombia be similar to those conducted with undergraduates at universities in the US? So first of all, you are going out of the US and you are going out of the university setting. In the baseline, no communication experiments, Cardenas found a similar pattern as in the laboratory experiments. Villagers substantially overinvested in the CPR. The average earning for a participant was about 1 day of paid labor for an exercise of 2 to 3 hours. However, they could double their earnings if participants could agree to cooperate, which came from communication. Face-to-face communication significantly increased the performance of the groups, although not quite to the maximum level. So in a real life setting, they are not doing any calculations to optimize to reach the maximum level of group income, but communications do lead to increased performance of the entire group. Okay, so we'll come back and look at more dynamic CPR experiments to get, we are heading slowly towards as real a situation as possible, remembering that these are still experiments and that real world is always a bit more complicated, but the basic tenets of how humans think in these situations of self-governance are still very critical insights, very valuable lessons, and they do have value for the real world as well, which we'll see later in the book, of course. Okay.